Hi, and thank you for joining me for another video. And friends, today I want to try to explain Jewish mysticism and its gradual development throughout Jewish history. And to really understand the basis of this topic, we will have to go back to the roots of what later became known as Judaism to better encapsulate the core of mysticism within the Jewish experience. And the historical progression of Jewish spirituality begins with 1, the words that appear in Torah, 2, the words of the prophets and Ketuvim and the writings, 3, the words of Chazal, our sages, and 4, they also come from customs that we adopted from other societies, and 5, sometimes they come from personal, innovative imagery. Friends, first and foremost, there was Torah. And when I mean first and foremost, it's within the context that it was first given and when Jewish history began to be documented. In other words, from Parashat Yitro, which no one could deny was surely not just a spiritual experience, but according to the Torah's understanding, the first validated mass, grand-scale mystical experience the world ever saw. In other words, Judaism itself began with a mystical experience, and the most profound mystical experience ever. Why? Because, my friends, the mystical became physical. The light, the smoke, the voice and the will of God actually interacted with humanity. And only after this revelation were we then able to fill in what happened before the revelation, from Bereshit to Yetziat Mitzrayim onto Har Sinai. And it didn't stop there, but it continued to basically the Jewish people were about to enter the land of Israel. And that's it. And I mean it, friends. That's really it. At least in terms of what is mystical, of what can be considered spiritual within the Jewish experience, the authentic Jewish experience. Friends, what are we stating? We're stating that regarding what a Jew was bound to believe, all this began and ended with Torah. In other words, what appeared in Torah was the only form of spirituality that was ever truly validated. How? Because as Torah Jews, we believe that it came from HaKodesh Baruch Hu himself. In other words, in the Jewish world, it was not considered mere opinion. And friends, you must also know that we as Jews do not believe in Torah because of its mystical aspects, but initially because of the instructions given within it. That actually work in bettering society on a moral level. And then, friends, and only then, by ethically working, they validate that the Creator is not only good, but a God who is trustworthy, a faithful God. And then, friends, and only then are we as readers able to absorb any miracle as not only probable and possible, but most importantly relevant as a testimony to our Creator's greatness. So, Yetziat Mitzrayim, although it was packed with miracles, should be appreciated for what it was, which was the greatest act of divine mercy that any God ever bestowed on a downtrodden people. And these were the reasons for them to believe, for the Hebrews back then to believe, and the instructions given later was the reasons for them to continue believing. And we, friends, have the luxury of taking it all in from within the comfort of our Humashim. My point, friends, is that mysticism, even in our foundational text of Torah, was never even a reason to believe in the first place, and was always only used as a means of the Almighty's delivering earthly practical results. My point in saying this, friends, is that mysticism, even in our foundational text, the Torah, was never even a reason to believe in the first place. In other words, even the spiritual aspects of Torah needed to have a practical and ethical purpose to them. And the reason I'm mentioning this is because this will act as a foundation for what Judaism considers mysticism. Because it would be ridiculous for anyone to assume that only because someone comes along and considers anything a mystical or spiritual manifestation of the Almighty's will, that this should be believed or even accepted. And this is actually the Torah's definition for what mysticism is, at least in the Jewish world, which is a spiritual manifestation of the divine will. In other words, anything to be at least justified from a Judaic perspective as being mystical or spiritual, it would first need to claim to be sanctioned or validated by the divine. Right? Simple enough. And there is really no contention here. In other words, All this so far seems to be universally accepted, at least in seeming biblically logical. Because as believers in Torah, we know that the only divine mass revelation that humanity ever received from the Creator was Torah, which tells us that anything and everything one considers mystical and or spiritual as a Jew must in some way appear in Torah to at least be considered undoubtedly sanctioned by the Creator himself. And at least according to the Torah, we know that it only sanctions newer revelations under the guise of nevuah, of prophecy. In other words, the Almighty stated that He will send us prophets. Now, in the Jewish world, as far as I know, there aren't too many people claiming to have this gift, at least not nowadays. Now, supposedly, the Ramchal, I believe in Mesilat Yesharim, claims that if one masters his sefer, they would be ready to attain prophecy. And many other Rebbeim, including the Rambam himself, held that prophecy never really ceased, and that people today could actually acquire it. Unlike the Medrash that states the opinion that only children and fools today can attain prophecy. However, the role of the prophet was only used to inform the Jewish people and never to establish instructions. Because remember, this is what the Torah was for. Now, Torah Shebiktav did sanction the later creation of binding, innovative, and practical ideas outside of what appears in Torah to be developed through the office of the judge or judges of Israel. But this too itself, my friends, had its limitations. For example, friends, these innovations had to always reside within the realm of law, or the keeping of Torah itself. As it's stated in Parashat Shoftim, Ki yipalei mimecha davar lashpat ben dan ladam, ben dim ladin, uve nega lanega divrei rirot bisharecha. That if there arise a matter too hard for you in judgment, in mishpat, right? And now the words we're speaking about here is law, between blood and blood, between plea and plea, between stroke and stroke, and even in matters of controversy within your gates. And then it continues, Al pi haTorah asher yerucha ve'al hamishpat asher yomru lecha ta'aseh, that according to the law which they teach you, that these judges teach you, and according to the judgment which they shall tell you, this you shall do. Now, this here is where we get the mitzvah of listening to our sages, the mitzvah of lo tasur, of not straying from their rulings. Really, the core of rabbinical Judaism, what later became known as Torah Sheba'al Peh. In other words, these ideas could never contain anything mystical, because again, these were still only man-made innovations, authorized by the Creator, no less, but still just the rulings of an earthly court. And I mean, no one claims that the Tanaim had nevuah, although historically we did have many prophets who sat in the court as well. So regarding prophets, were they allowed to create new laws or establish a new metaphysical reality? Absolutely not, my friends. As a matter of fact, the prophet in Judaism, in Torah, as the Jewish layman, was not allowed to add or take away from Torah itself. Now, the Rambam does bring down that a prophet could temporarily halt a certain mitzvah for the greater good, as he would be advised to do by the Creator, like we see that Eliyahu Hanavi did on Mount Carmel. But in terms of describing any mystical aspect about the divine or the supposed spiritual realms, if this is done by the prophet, this only exists in the realm of opinion. In other words, the job of the prophet was only to bring Israel back to Torah by almost always just reminding Israel what would befall them for doing such and such, and in no way, friends, to establish a new metaphysical reality. In other words, friends, when speaking about prophets in Torah, nowhere does it state that books should have ever been written regarding how they received their dreams or visions. Why? Because according to Torah, this was not important. As a matter of fact, Chazal, our sages, only canonized the books of the prophets because of their historical value, depicting how our righteous prophets behaved throughout our history as a people. And the second reason was to give us hope, reminding us on how faithful our Creator has been throughout the centuries, letting us know that as long as we turn back to HaKodesh Baruch Hu, He is there waiting to receive us with open arms. Again, all principles rooted in Torah. Now, the issue arises, friends, when people have a historical account of the prophets sitting in the same book right next to the Torah, and they begin confusing the prophetical account as Torah itself. So, again, friends, regarding the Torah, The role of the prophets, again, is only to impart a divine message from our Creator, not to establish how those prophecies were received as some sort of gateway to something divine. Which is why Chazal would have never endorsed the writing of the prophets and the Ketuvim together with the Torah, what we call today Tanakh. Why? Out of fear that people would do what is done today, like quote a pasuk in Kohelet with the same authoritative reverence as if they were quoting a pasuk in Shmot. In other words, the Torah is authorized to establish belief, and the other books are not. That's pretty simple. To the point that Torah, my friends, is very clear on how do you know if a prophet is true or if a prophet is false. And it states only if the message he delivers comes true. And it also commands us to obey those messages. In other words, it limits the role of the prophets only to someone who relays messages about something that will or will not happen. And again, not as someone who was to expound on the metaphysical or as to in some way create a new metaphysical reality. This is even said by many Meforshim about Bilam's prophecy as to whether the donkey actually spoke or not, or if it was just something that was there for Bilam to see. Like we see with Sefer Iyov, the book of Job, Chazal asked the question that if anything depicted in Sefer Iyov could be taken as actually happening, or factual, or it's just there as a mushal, as a parable leading us to a Torah truth, a greater Torah truth, which is actually how the Rambam felt. Or when it states in Sefer Yeshayahu that the lamb will lie down with a lion, and a lion will eat straw instead of eat meat. On this pasuk, the Rambam states that this just means that Israel, as the lamb, will live in safety, not bothered by their more violent neighbors. And their violence, the violence of their neighbors, will be nullified. And honestly, the more you think about that, the more it makes sense, my friends, that this is what the meaning must have meant. Because this is how it would have sounded to the listeners back then, which is why so much is lost when a prophecy is written down and the language being used loses its cultural draw to modern ears. As Yeshayahu himself states in Perichet Pasuk Chaf, Le Torah velit uda lo yimeru kedavar chazeh asher ein lo shachad. Basically saying that for the Torah, that this is our standard. If what we speak is not according to the words of Torah, there is no light in our words. And friends, you can't put it any simpler than that. I remember discussing this with a Christian, and then he stated that even the Rambam states in his Yud Gimel Karamuna, Principle Vav. Now this was an Israeli Christian. He said the Rambam states there, Kol divrei haneviim chemaim eitim, that all the words of the prophets are true. Now I had to tell them that the Rambam never stated anything like this in his parish, the Perek Halak, from which the 13 principles are derived from. Actually, 99.9% of the list of the Rambam's 13 principles of faith are actually not what he wrote, but a paraphrase based on previous abridgments of what later became known as the 13 principles of faith, or the Animanim. Actually, the 6th principle only states that we believe that prophecy is true, i.e. corrected, validated prophecy, not in any way stating that the works of the prophets as we have them today are necessarily accurate, or that errors cannot exist in the prophetical works, or worse, that what the prophets may have been describing should be taken literally, which was really what his point was. Which is why the Rambam states that prophecy virtually always was transmitted when one was asleep. And in these dreams and visions, the Almighty speaks and delivers the message in the best way the prophet of that time could have understood them. In other words, like we said, that the imagery the prophecy contained was not important, but only the message. Which is what made Moshe Rabbeinu's prophecy so unique and superior, because every other prophet saw the message through a prism, which is all the esoteric fluff we see in the narrative that creates so much division among those who take it literally nowadays. But Moshe Rabbeinu received his without any form of filtration. And remember, friends, my goal in explaining all this to you in the first place, and that is to explain how mystical Judaism first got its start. And you're probably wondering, why all these checks and balances? Why are they so necessary? And the answer to this, friends, is to guard the authenticity of Torah. In other words, if sources outside of Torah can redefine our Creator's Torah, after a bit, the Torah you end up with will not in any way resemble what you may have started out with. Not to mention that the Torah itself explicitly tells its readers, "Hanisara la'Adonai Eloheinu, ve'haniglot lanu ulvaneinu ad olam lasot et kol divrei haTorah hazot," that the secret things belong to God, but the things which are revealed belong to us and our children forever, that we may do all the words of this Torah. Now, although we know that for something to be legally and even spiritually authoritative, it must appear in Torah, even within Torah, regarding its statements that are not clear and whose meanings one could say are unknowable, the Torah here tells us to ignore them as well. Basically stating not to waste our time, but just focus on the only thing that should unite us, which is the keeping of the laws within the Torah. In other words, in our society, you have so much division, especially among Christians and other groups who don't have an oral law to harmonize certain concepts, that makes these groups stumble on esoteric statements that are void of receiving an objective response. Now, I don't think there is anything wrong with someone personalizing certain esoteric pesukim, as to say that it may be speaking directly to you. No, the problem arises when someone begins to condemn others for not accepting their personal interpretation of a certain pasuk or parak. But again, it was these esoteric portions of not just the prophets, but even the Torah that first gave Judaism mystics. And it was also these very portions that later gave birth to what in Judaism we call Agadah or Agarata, also known as Midrash or Midrashim. Okay, now moving on. During and post the Second Temple. So now we are in Jewish mysticism during and post Bayit Sheni, the Second Temple. So anyways, what are Agadot? Well, friends, literally, they are legends and tales. Actually, Agadot is what we consider anything we find within the writings of our sages that is not of a legal nature. Now, why is this important to know? Well, mainly because the authoritative framework that Chazal, our sages, worked through consisted of a court which later became known as the Sanhedrin. And as a court, their rulings were voted into existence. And friends, when I say Chazal or our sages, anytime during this video or any one of my lectures, know that I'm only referring to Tanaim and the members of the court that came before them. But anyways, there's really no difference between Agarata and Midrash. Well, almost nothing. At least as they're understood nowadays. If anything, legends and tales that appear in the Gemara are called Agadot, while the stories that appear in later works like the Midrash Rabbah and the like are known as Midrashim. But in this lecture, I will just call them both Agadah. Now, there are really three types of Agadot. The first type are Agadot that speak on scripture. The second type are Agadot that speak on rabbinic statements. And the third are Agadot that creates its own reality. And this is really excluding what is known as Midrash Halacha. That is really neither Agadah nor Midrash. In other words, the only reason it is known as Midrash or Midrash Halacha, or by its earlier name Midrash Torah, is that it's literally a Midrash of Torah. In other words, an examination of the Torah text from whence Halacha is developed from, or was later developed from by Chazal, and not in any way a subjective legend or tale. And what we consider Midrash Halacha must either stem from the Sifra, the Sifri, or the Mechilta. Actually, the truth is that the Tanaim authored less than 5% of what is known as Agadah nowadays, which is typically what you find in Ein Yaakov. Actually, you wouldn't even believe how many Midrashim are of unknown authors, and some with authors dating all the way up to the Middle Ages. However, all this falls on deaf ears, mainly because people have been trained to equate Midrash or Agadah, no matter where it comes from, with Chazal. And worse, some would even go as far as to consider them all part of Torah Shebaal Peh, all part of the oral law. Now, there are different ways to be able to bundle in stories that have nothing to do with Torah Shebaal Peh, oral law, as Torah Shebaal Peh. And this has been done throughout the ages by just calling them Mesorah or tradition. Instead of oral law, they're called oral tradition, right? That makes a little more sense, at least in English. Now, Kabbalists like the Ramchal were one of the first who began to include Agadot as part of oral law by stating that Torah Sheba'al Peh had two components to it, Chelek HaMitzvot and Chelek HaSodot. But this is a much later understanding because Rishonim and Geonim had a much different understanding regarding this issue. But regardless, the reason this was done in the first place is because Torah Sheba'al Peh is binding. In other words, something that we must do, right? Lo tasud, mitzvah deraita. The problem is that lo tasud never included belief, but only what you did. Actually practical halacha. But like we said before, that belief comes only from Torah. And even the term Torah Sheba'al Peh, oral law, the reason Haggadah cannot be Torah Sheba'al Peh is because it contains no law. And again, all this has given birth to mysticism built on stories, not necessarily tied to anything in particular. Next, we're going to cover mysticism built around or created from rabbinic or Torah laws, along with the deification of oral laws. In other words, if a law was developed by the court, like halakha tells you about the prohibition of consuming halav akum, of drinking non-kosher milk, right? Then you have the Balatanya come in and say that if someone drank non-kosher milk, even unknowingly, that this would end up harming that person's soul. Or if suddenly, if your family became ill, that you must first check your mezuzot to see if they've become invalidated, thus blaming that for the cause. Or regarding the halakha of not carrying within an eruv, the Arizal added that if by someone unknowingly carrying dust in their shoe, one would have to pay for that infraction in Gehenna. No matter how ultimately logical or illogical the outcome may be, these are all mystical ideas built off of Jewish laws, either from the Torah or from a rabbinic level. Okay, clear enough? Now, the Torah itself many times gives metaphysical consequences for not keeping its mitzvot. The difference here is that the Torah is laying down the idea, and it's not human endeavor doing so. In other words, if anything is going to be labeled Judaism, it cannot originate from the mind of man. Now, if it does, you could believe it, and you could even live your life based on it, but what you can't do is call it Judaism, or worse, condemn someone else for not agreeing with you on it. The next area I want to cover today is mysticism copied from other societies, like the Chamsa or the Red Bindle or even Gilgulim. And friends, one principle you should always remember is that only because something is believed or practiced by the Jewish people does not necessarily mean it is Jewish or that it should be considered Judaism. Now, one argument made by those who do not want to give up their foreign ideas is that because Judaism has accepted the idea that it must have been originally Jewish and then forgotten and then adopted by pagans and then rediscovered by Jews. Again, friends, under those auspices, you'd be able to justify anything, and by doing so, you'd be obviously harming the authenticity of what we call Torah. And I think this in itself is pretty self-explanatory. Okay, and the last type of mysticism I want to discuss today, friends, is the innovative kind, which ultimately has no Torah or Talmudic or Aggadic source attached to it, but mainly arises out of the need to explain the unexplainable. For example, they'll say that the reason children die during childbirth is because they were the reincarnation of a wicked Jew and thus were paying for their sins of a previous life. Or if you're having a bad day, that it must be the evil eye someone released on you and you must consult a Kabbalist to get it removed. And the examples in this area, my friends, are endless. The truth is that in life, we do not have all the answers for everything that happens. And the truth is that not even the Torah does. Some things just happen, my friends, and no one knows or will ever know why. Which is why Chazal state that we should be in the habit of saying we don't know and not always run to try to give an answer. And this really, in my opinion, is the root of all that is mystical within our emunah, which is an attempt not to tolerate what's coincidental or unexplainable. And the problem arises when we begin to exclude others for not agreeing with our hypothesis. Now, there are certainly times when someone's hypothesis should not even be tolerated, and that's when it labels itself Judaism, when neither Torah Sheba'al Peh nor Torah Shebektav endorses it, or when it unjustly hurts other people, my friends. Okay? So, for more information, my friends, about everything Jewish, please visit TorahJudaism.org. Thank you.